The people of Oakhaven brought Tessa Miller to the river before noon, when the heat was strong enough to soften the pitch between the boards of the ferry landing. No one called it an execution. Sheriff Benjamin Reed called it an agreement. Reverend Cole called it a sacrifice for the common good. Her father called it the only choice left to them. Tessa stood in her pale Sunday dress with the sun pressing through the fabric and watched Silas Miller rub his thumb over the treaty until the ink blurred beneath his sweat. The document promised 12 months without raids on the settlement, safe passage for supply wagons, and the return of 30 cattle that had wandered into contested grazing land. In exchange, Oakhaven would surrender one unmarried woman to Nantan Ironwood, the Apache scout the townspeople called the Ghost of the Gila. The language on the page was careful. It mentioned kinship, goodwill, and a bond between communities. It did not mention that the council had drawn lots behind the church, with the doors locked. It did not mention that Silas had offered his daughter's name before anyone reached for the hat. Her mother stood a few feet away, twisting the corner of her apron. Martha had cried through the night, but now her face was dry and empty. Tessa had begged her to speak when Silas first announced the council's decision. Martha had only gripped her hands and whispered that a wife survived by knowing when words would make a man worse. That morning she had packed Tessa one wool blanket, a comb, 2 pairs of stockings, and a cracked earthenware bowl repaired years earlier with pine resin. There had been no dress for winter, no extra boots, no food for the journey. "Your husband will provide," Silas had said. Now he could not look at her. Sheriff Reed cleared his throat. Around them men shifted in the dust. Tessa recognized every face. Mr. Pike from the dry goods store had once given her a peppermint when she was 10. Amos Bell had danced with her at the harvest supper. The blacksmith had repaired the Miller stove and refused payment when Silas's wheat failed. None of them stepped forward. A boy perched in the cottonwood above the landing whispered that he could see a rider. The murmur moved through the crowd before the dust appeared. Nantan came alone. He rode a dark bay mare down the stony bank with no hurry in him. He wore a buckskin shirt weathered pale at the shoulders, dark trousers tucked into moccasins, and a narrow braid tied at the back of his neck. A Winchester rested across his saddle. Tessa had heard stories about that rifle since childhood. Men claimed it had fired from 3 different ridges in the same minute. Women said Nantan could shoot the flame from a lantern without breaking the glass. Children dared one another to say his name near the foothills after dark. The man himself looked neither supernatural nor eager. He looked tired. A pale scar crossed the left side of his jaw. Another disappeared beneath his collar. He stopped his horse outside the ring of townspeople and surveyed the riverbank, the wagons, the armed men, and finally Tessa. His gaze rested on her long enough to register the dust on her dress and the rope burn on her palm where she had gripped her mare's reins too tightly. Then he looked away. Sheriff Reed lifted the treaty. By the authority of the Oakhaven Council, the terms agreed upon are fulfilled. Miss Tessa Miller is delivered into your household, and the peace stands for 1 year from this date. Nantan did not reach for the paper. Reed's smile tightened. "You understand? I understand what you have done," Nantan said. His English was low and exact. It silenced the landing more effectively than a shout. Silas flinched. Sheriff Reed recovered first. "The girl has a horse. Her belongings are tied behind the saddle." Nantan looked at the bundle. 1 blanket, 1 small bag, a bowl wrapped in an apron. He dismounted and walked to Tessa's mare. Every man near him gave ground without seeming to mean to. Up close, he was taller than she had expected, broad through the chest with hands marked by old cuts and hard work. He did not touch her. He took the lead rope, checked the mare's cinch, and tightened a loose strap. Tessa waited for him to speak to her. He did not. Her father released the reins as if the leather burned him. "Papa," she said. Silas stared at the mud near his boots. Tessa had not intended to plead. The word escaped before pride could stop it. For 1 awful second she saw him almost look up. Then Reverend Cole put a hand on his shoulder, and Silas turned toward town. Martha followed. She did not embrace her daughter. She only pressed both fists against her mouth and walked away with her back bent. The rest went after them. Amos Bell removed his hat but said nothing. Mr. Pike would not meet her eyes. Sheriff Reed remained until everyone else reached the mesquite, perhaps because duty required a witness, perhaps because he feared turning his back on Nantan. Nantan mounted. He held the lead rope loosely and guided both horses toward the north trail. Tessa stayed where she was. He looked over his shoulder. "I will not drag you," he said. "Where else can I go?" His expression did not change, but something passed through his eyes that felt like anger aimed beyond her. "That is not the same as choosing." She nearly laughed. The sound would have broken into tears, so she swallowed it. "No," she said, "it is not." She put her boot in the stirrup and climbed into the saddle. They left Oakhaven behind without another word. The first hours carried them through country Tessa knew. Low mesquite, dried grass, shallow washes where cattle tracks hardened into clay. By afternoon, the land began to rise. The trail narrowed between walls of red stone, and the heat changed from the broad oven of the valley to a trapped, breathless pressure between cliffs. Nantan rode ahead. He never asked whether she was tired, but he shortened his pace when her mare stumbled. Twice he dismounted to lead the horses across loose shale. Once he stopped beneath a shelf of rock, handed her a water skin, and turned his back while she drank. She watched the muscles move beneath his shirt and wondered when the courtesy would end. In Oakhaven, kindness was often alone with interest. A man carried a sack of flour for a widow and expected praise at church. Silas gave Tess a ribbon for her birthday and reminded her of its price for months. Sheriff Reed opened doors for ladies, then signed a paper that exchanged one of them for cattle. Nantan gave her water and asked for nothing. That frightened her more than a demand would have. Near sunset, the trail climbed above the last stands of scrub oak. The air cooled quickly. Tessa's damp collar turned cold against her neck, and her thighs shook from hours in the saddle. Nantan led them into a hollow surrounded by ponderosa pines. Their bark released a faint smell of vanilla where the day's warmth lingered. He built a small fire, not the cheerful blaze she would have made, but a low bed of coals hidden between stones. He unsaddled both horses, rubbed them down with handfuls of dry grass, and checked their hooves. Only then did he turn to her. "You can sleep by the fire. And you?" He pointed toward a shelf of stone beyond the light. Tessa looked into the dark. "Why so far?" "Because you are afraid." The plainness of the answer left her without one of her own. He spread her wool blanket beside the fire. From his pack he took dried venison and a small cake of parched corn. He placed half on a flat stone near her, then carried his portion into the shadows. Tessa ate because hunger was stronger than suspicion. The meat was smoky and tough. The corn stuck between her teeth. Wind moved high in the trees, and something cried from the canyon below. She lay down fully dressed with the blanket to her chin. Nantan sat against the rock with the Winchester across his knees. The barrel caught the firelight each time the coals shifted. It was pointed toward the trail, never toward her. She woke several times. Each time he was still there. At dawn he had already saddled the horses. The second day was harder. They climbed into thin air where each breath felt unfinished. Tessa's hands blistered around the saddle horn. The lace at her cuffs tore on thorny brush. Once her mare slipped near the edge of a steep drop and lurched sideways. Nantan seized the bridle and planted both feet. The mare's hindquarters slid, scattering pebbles into the gorge. He spoke to the animal in a language Tessa did not understand, his voice steady while the tendons stood out along his forearm. Slowly the mare found her footing. Tessa could not release the saddle horn. Nantan looked up at her. "Breathe. I am breathing. No, you are waiting to fall." She drew air into her lungs. It came out shaking. He remained beside the mare until her grip loosened. Then he continued upward as if nothing had happened. Late that afternoon, the trees opened around a small clearing sheltered by a ridge of dark stone. A cabin stood at its center. Tessa had expected a camp, perhaps hides stretched over poles, perhaps a rough shelter with smoke leaking through the roof. The cabin was made of cedar logs fitted so closely that only thin lines of clay showed between them. A stone chimney rose from one end. Firewood stood beneath a linda, stacked in rows as straight as books on a shelf. A spring ran through a split cedar trough near the trees. Nantan dismounted and took both horses to a small corral. Tessa slid from the saddle on legs that almost failed beneath her. She caught herself against the mare. He noticed but did not offer his hand. She could not decide whether she was relieved or insulted. When the animals were settled, he opened the cabin door and stood aside. Inside, the floorboards were swept. A bed frame occupied one corner, covered with furs and a folded quilt. There was a pine table, 2 stools, shelves holding jars of salt, beans, dried herbs, and coffee. A black iron stove stood beside the stone hearth. One wall held tools, saw, axe, shovel, traps, coils of rope. The room smelled of cedar shavings, leather, and old smoke. It looked lived in, but not claimed by clutter. Everything had a place. Tessa stepped across the threshold and waited. Nantan set her bundle inside. He placed the repaired bowl on the table without unwrapping it. Then he went back out. She turned. "Where are you going?" "To tend the horses." "And after that?" He glanced toward the porch. "I will sleep outside." She studied him for mockery and found none. "This is your house." "It is yours tonight." "Because the treaty says so?" His jaw tightened. "The paper says many things." He closed the door from the outside. Tessa stood motionless until the light faded from the window. When she finally tested the latch, it opened easily. There was no lock outside. The only bar lay on 2 hooks inside the room. She lifted it and fitted it across the door. A short while later, the porch boards creaked under Nantan's weight. He sat with his back against the door. Through the wood she could hear the faint scrape of the rifle as he laid it across his knees. She lowered herself to the floor on the other side. 3 inches of cedar separated them. "Are there wolves?" she asked. "Yes." "Mountain lions?" "Yes." "Men?" A pause. "Sometimes." She pressed her palm against the door. "And you intend to sit there all night?" "Yes." "Why?" The porch creaked as he shifted. "So you may sleep." Tessa almost told him she could not sleep with a stranger at her door, but the stranger was outside, in the cold, facing the dark. The bar was beneath her hand. The bed was behind her. No man in her life had ever given her that much control over a room. She slept badly, but she slept. Morning entered through the small window in a gray strip. Tessa woke beneath the quilt and lay still, listening. No boots crossed the floor. No voice ordered her to light the stove. She removed the bar and opened the door. The porch was empty except for 2 cleaned rabbits laid on a piece of bark. Beside them sat a handful of wild onions and a whetstone. Nantan was at the corral repairing a broken rail. Tessa carried the food inside. She spent the morning learning the cabin. Under a floorboard she found sacks of beans and cornmeal. A tin held coffee. Another contained precious sugar, no more than a cup. There were candles made from tallow, soap wrapped in cloth, and a bundle of dried mint. She skinned the remaining bits from the rabbits, cut the meat, and set a stew to simmer with onion and salt. The ordinary work steadied her. The knife made a clean sound against the board. The stove ticked as it warmed. Steam fogged the window. For several hours she was not a daughter sold by her father or a wife delivered by treaty. She was simply a hungry woman preparing supper. At dusk she filled the cracked bowl and carried it to the door. Nantan sat on the porch step cleaning dirt from a horse's hoof. He looked up as the door opened. Tessa set the bowl near him. "You brought the meat." He stared at the stew as if it were an unfamiliar object. "I did. So eat." His gaze moved to her face, then to the bowl. "Is this payment?" The question irritated her because it was the same one she had been asking about him. "It is supper." She went inside and closed the door. After a while came the soft click of the spoon against pottery. Tessa sat at the table with her own portion and listened until the bowl was empty. The next days formed a cautious pattern. Nantan left before sunrise and returned with meat, roots, or news written in the condition of his clothes. Dust meant he had gone down the southern trail. Pine needles in his hair meant the higher woods. Once he came back with a cut across his forearm and washed it at the spring before she could ask. He repaired the corral, cut wood, and set snares. Tessa cleaned the cabin, baked coarse cornbread, washed clothes, and learned how quickly mountain weather could turn. They worked within sight of one another but rarely spoke. The silence changed first. At the river it had been a wall. At the cabin it became a path they both knew how to walk. One afternoon Tessa hung sheets between 2 oaks while a hard wind rushed over the ridge. Nantan sat nearby mending a harness with a bone awl. A gust tore the largest sheet from her hands and wrapped it over his head and shoulders. She froze. Silas would have cursed. Sheriff Reed would have laughed and pulled the cloth down hard enough to rip it. Nantan sat perfectly still beneath the damp linen. "Tessa," he said from inside the sheet. "Yes? May I move?" The question startled a laugh out of her. It was only one breath of sound, but it was the first laughter the mountain had taken from her rather than swallowed. She walked over and lifted the sheet from his face. His expression remained solemn, though a slight warmth had entered his eyes. "You may move," she said. He returned to the harness. Tessa carried the sheet back to the line, smiling despite herself. The next morning, she found a pair of leather gloves on the porch. They were too small for Nantan and fit her hands exactly. She did not thank him. Instead, she repaired the torn seam in his spare shirt and left it folded beside his rifle. That became their language. He carved a wooden peg where she kept dropping the water pail. She added coffee to his evening bowl. He built a low step beside the bed because he had seen her favoring her knee after the long ride. She replaced the loose braid tie at his neck with a strip cut from the blue ribbon on her ruined Sunday dress. He held the ribbon for a long time before using it. 1 week after her arrival, Tessa followed a patch of service berries beyond the clearing. Nantan had shown her which plants were safe, but he was checking traps on the western slope, and she wanted to prove she could bring something home herself. The berries darkened her fingertips. Jays scolded from the branches. Sunlight broke through the trees in narrow bars. Then the woods went silent. Tessa straightened. A cold pressure settled between her shoulders. She turned too quickly, caught her boot beneath a root, and slid down a bank of loose soil toward a narrow ravine. Her pail flew from her hand. Berries scattered across the slope. She clawed at the ground. Her fingers closed around a cedar branch wedged between two rocks. It held. Panting, she pulled herself up and lay on her stomach until the trembling stopped. The branch had been cut and shaped. Bark was stripped from the place where a hand would grip. A flat stone braced its lower end. Nantan had placed it there. She found 2 more along the path back, each at a place where the trail crumbled near a drop. He had prepared for mistakes she had not yet made. At sunset he returned carrying a mountain lion pelt over one shoulder. Blood stained his sleeve and 4 fresh claw marks ran across his ribs. Tessa met him beside the corral. "You knew it was following me." He lowered the pelt to the ground away from the cabin. "I knew it was near. You could have told me. You would have stayed inside. I nearly fell into the ravine. You found the handhold. That does not make it a lesson." He stood her anger without defending himself. "No," he said. "It makes it my mistake." The admission took the force from her next words. Blood darkened his shirt. Tessa pointed toward the cabin. "Come inside." He looked at the threshold. "I need to clean those cuts. I can do it. With what eyes? They are on your side." He glanced down as if the placement of the wounds surprised him. Tessa opened the door wider. "I am inviting you." Nantan wiped his boots carefully before entering. He sat on the stool nearest the door while she boiled water and tore linen from an old petticoat. Removing his shirt revealed a body marked by more injuries than she could count, narrow knife scars. A puckered bullet wound near his shoulder burns along one side. The lion's claws had cut deep but clean. Tessa washed the wounds. Nantan did not flinch until the cloth touched an older scar circling his wrist. She paused. The mark was not from battle. It formed a pale ring, thick and even, where iron had once pressed into flesh. There was another on his other wrist. "What made those?" she asked. His gaze settled on the stove. "Chains." Tessa waited. Nantan spoke slowly, not because his English was poor, but because each word seemed to come from a place he kept guarded. He had been 16 when Mexican soldiers captured him south of the border. For 3 years he worked in a mine, hauling rock in darkness with iron around his wrists and ankles. Men died beside him from fever, thirst, falling stone. An overseer called them animals and said survival was proof they belonged to him. Nantan escaped during a flood that filled the lower tunnels. He broke one chain with a miner's hammer and dragged the other for 2 days before an old woman from a farming village cut it away. "When I came north," he said, "I promised I would never become the man with the key." Tessa tied the bandage beneath his arm. "And when Oakhaven offered you a wife, I refused." She looked up sharply. "They sent the proposal 3 times, he continued. The first asked for peace. The second offered cattle. The third said if I did not accept, men from the territory would come into the mountains, and both sides would bury children by winter. So you took me to stop a war. I came to take you away from men who had already decided you were less valuable than their fear." The words hurt because they were true. "You could have let me leave. I still can. Where would I go? That question belongs to you, not to me." She tightened the knot harder than necessary. Nantan drew a quiet breath but did not complain. "You speak as if choice is simple," she said. "A woman alone does not walk into the valley and invent a life. She needs land, money, people willing to sell to her. Oakhaven would close every door, then stay until you know another road. And what do you receive? Peace, perhaps. For your people? For this house." Tessa sat back on her heels. The cabin fire cracked. Outside, the horses shifted in the corral. Blood and boiled yarrow scented the room. Nantan reached for his shirt, but she stopped him. "The bandage needs to dry," he lowered his hand. "You may sleep inside tonight," she said, "near the door." His eyes lifted to hers. "The invitation ends at dawn," she added. A faint change touched his mouth. Not quite a smile. "At dawn," he agreed. Tessa slept with the bar unfastened. When she woke, he was gone from the stool. The door stood closed, and the bar rested where she had left it. On the table lay a smooth gray river stone, round enough to fit in her palm. She had found it earlier inside his spare moccasin and replaced it without asking. Now he had given it to her. She kept it beside the repaired bowl. Autumn entered the mountains through the smell of frost. Grass silvered overnight. Elk moved down from the high meadows. The spring trough froze at its edges each morning. Nantan began preparing the cabin for winter. He showed Tessa how to stack wood with the bark facing upward, how to stuff moss into gaps between logs, how to hang strips of venison where smoke would cure them without cooking them. He taught her to read clouds caught on the western peaks and to recognize the soft, deep print of snow that would not hold a man's weight. She taught him to make bread that did not crack a tooth. Their first loaf rose unevenly because the cabin was cold. Nantan cut it with his hunting knife, examined the dense center, and ate 2 pieces. "You do not have to finish it," she said. "It is food. It is a weapon." He looked at the loaf again. A poor one. Tessa laughed so hard she had to grip the table. This time he smiled. It changed his face. The legend disappeared, leaving a man several years younger, almost shy in the warmth of the stove. She looked away first. Some evenings they spoke. Not much, but enough to give shape to the lives they had lived before the river. Tessa told him about Massachusetts, where she had been born. She described gray water striking black rocks, gulls fighting over fish guts, salt collecting on window glass. When she was 12, Silas moved the family west after a failed shipping business. He had promised land and independence. Instead, he found debt, drought, and new people to blame. Nantan had never seen the ocean. "Does it end?" he asked. "Not when you are standing beside it. The mountain feels that way from below." The ocean sounds like the mountain in a storm. He considered this. Then perhaps they are relatives. She told him her mother used to sing while gutting fish and had stopped after coming west. She did not tell him how often Silas shouted, or how Martha learned to move silently around his anger. Nantan seemed to hear the missing parts anyway. He told her about his older sister Atsa, who had taught him to set rabbit snares and once broke his nose for mocking her singing. She died of fever during his captivity. He had learned years later from a cousin. The smooth stone came from the river near the place where they had played as children. Tessa pushed it across the table. "Then I should not keep it." He covered it with his hand and moved it back. Memory becomes heavy when one person carries it. She left the stone beside the bowl. The first true storm came at the end of October. Rain struck the roof sideways. Wind tore a branch from the oak near the spring and sent it rolling through the yard. Nantan returned from the upper trail after dark, soaked through, and took his usual place on the porch. Tessa watched water stream from his hair through a crack in the shutter. She opened the door. "Come inside." He remained seated. "The rain is already inside my boots," he said. "That is not an argument for staying out. I will dirty the floor. I own a broom." Lightning flashed beyond the trees. Thunder shook the window. Nantan looked at her with the same uncertainty he had shown when she first offered stew. Tessa stepped back. "The invitation lasts until the storm passes." He entered and removed his moccasins on the bare boards. He placed them at the edge of the rug, without letting the wet leather touch it. She gave him a blanket and set a bowl of elk stew on the table. This time she did not retreat to the other side of the room. She sat across from him. They ate while rain hammered the roof. Nantan used his left hand. His right rested near the knife at his belt. "You expect an attack during supper?" she asked. "I expect the world to remain itself." "Even here?" "Especially where I wish to believe it will not." Tessa looked at the old scars on his wrists. "Does peace ever stop feeling borrowed?" He stared into the bowl. "I do not know." It was the most unguarded answer he had given her. When the storm weakened, he rose to return outside. "You can stay," Tessa said. He waited. "Not because of the rain," she added, "because I am tired of speaking through a door." Nantan sat near the hearth. Tessa went to the bed and pulled the quilt over herself. For a long time, neither moved. Then he said, "Your father told Reed you would not fight the decision." She stared at the ceiling. "My father has always mistaken silence for agreement. I did not, no." Her throat tightened. "You did not." The fire settled. Nantan's shadow moved across the wall with each flame. Tessa closed her eyes. Near dawn she woke and found him asleep sitting upright, his head against the logs, one hand resting open on his knee. It was the first time she had seen him defenseless. She rose quietly, took the blue ribbon from her sewing box, and placed it beside his hand. When she woke again, the ribbon was braided into his hair. Winter came early. Snow erased the trail, the corral fence, and every stump in the yard. For 3 days the cabin existed inside a white world without distance. Wind packed snow against the door until Tessa had to push with both shoulders to open it. Nantan still tried to sleep on the porch. She carried Martha's wool blanket outside and draped it over him. He accepted it with a small bow of his head. An hour later she opened the door again. "You are coming in. The storm may hide tracks. The storm will bury you. I have slept in worse." That does not make it sensible. He looked toward the trees, though no trees were visible. Tessa folded her arms. "You told me the cabin was mine. If it is mine, I decide who is welcome. That is true." "You are welcome." The words left them both still. Nantan stood. Snow fell from the blanket around his shoulders. He stepped over the threshold and closed the door behind him, but did not touch the bar. Tessa slid it into place. They spent the night feeding the fire and listening to trees crack beneath the weight of ice. At midnight, a section of the lean-to collapsed. Nantan tied a rope around his waist and went out to save the driest wood. Tessa held the other end from the doorway, bracing both feet against the floor while wind tried to pull him into the white dark. When he returned, they were both laughing from fear and exhaustion. He dropped the logs by the stove. Snow melted in his hair and ran down his face. Tessa reached up without thinking and brushed a piece of ice from his eyebrow. Nantan went perfectly still. Her fingers hovered near his cheek. The scar beneath them felt warm. She lowered her hand. "Thank you," he said. "For the ice? For opening the door." The wind roared around the cabin. Tessa looked at the man the town had given her as a death sentence and understood with a clarity that frightened her that leaving no longer felt like freedom. Staying did. The storm kept them inside for 2 more days. There was nowhere to retreat except opposite sides of the same room. Tessa mended shirts by the window, while Nantan shaped arrow shafts near the hearth. He hummed under his breath when he worked, a low 4-note pattern that repeated until she began anticipating the turn of it. On the second afternoon, she asked what it meant. "It is for children learning to walk," he said. "You sing a walking song to arrows?" "To my hands. They forget patience." She threaded her needle. "Your hands seem very patient. They have had poor teachers." Tessa looked at the scars again, then at the arrow spinning slowly between his fingers. "Mine too," she said. No more was needed. At night he slept beside the door on a folded hide. The first night Tessa woke each time he shifted. The second she woke only once. By the third, the sound of his breathing had joined the stove's ticking and the wind's low pressure against the walls. The cabin no longer felt occupied by a stranger. It felt balanced by another heartbeat. When the sky finally cleared, morning light turned the snow blue. Nantan dug a passage from the porch to the woodpile. Tessa followed with a shovel, though he told her the drifts were too deep. "You cannot teach me to survive and then do every difficult thing yourself," she said. He considered that and handed her the lighter shovel. They worked until their shoulders burned. At noon they sat on the roof of the buried corral, eating cold bread and strips of venison while sunlight flashed across the valley. From that height, Oakhaven was hidden behind 3 ridges. "Do you ever go there?" Tessa asked. "When I must." "Do they know you trade with people beyond the valley?" "They know what fits the stories they prefer." She rubbed snow from her glove. "My father preferred stories in which every failure happened to him. Drought was punishment. Debt was betrayal. My mother's silence was disloyalty. I was ungrateful because I remembered promises he wanted forgotten." Nantan broke a piece of bread in half and gave her the larger portion. "Stories can be cages," he said. "And ghosts? Sometimes ghosts are doors." She glanced at the blue ribbon in his hair. "What does that make you?" His eyes met hers. Still deciding, the answer stayed with her. A week later, Tessa found the treaty at the bottom of her trunk. She had forgotten Martha tucked it beneath the quilt. Perhaps her mother thought proof of the marriage might protect her. Perhaps Silas wanted Nantan to keep a record of Oakhaven's obedience. The parchment smelled of dust and tallow. Silas's signature sprawled across the bottom. Reed sat beside it, clean and confident. Nantan came in carrying a bucket of water and saw the paper in her hands. "I did not bring it here," he said. "I know." She read the clauses again. "The woman named below shall enter the household of Nantan Ironwood and remain under his authority for the duration of the peace." The words looked smaller than they had at the river, more foolish, a row of ink trying to define months of cold labor, fear, and care. "What happens when the year ends?" she asked. "The cattle remain theirs." The trail remains open if they keep their men from our hunting grounds. And me? You remain yourself. That is not written here. No. Tessa opened the stove and laid the treaty over the flames. The parchment curled. Reed's name blackened first. Silas's lasted a moment longer, then broke into glowing fragments. Nantan set down the water bucket. If you want proof of what they did, I have proof. She held out her hands. I carried it up the mountain. The final corner collapsed into ash. Tessa closed the stove lid. Nantan did not praise her or tell her what the act meant. He simply swept the flakes that had escaped onto the floor and carried them outside with the morning ashes. That evening he moved his sleeping hide from beside the door to a place nearer the stove. It was only 4 feet, but Tessa noticed. As winter settled, they built a life from repeated tasks. They checked traps at dawn. They cut holes in the spring ice. They ground corn with a stone until their arms ached. Tessa learned to stitch moccasins from softened hide, and Nantan learned that coffee improved when he did not boil it until it tasted of burned bark. They argued once over salt. Nantan rationed it carefully, pinching only a few grains into the stew. Tessa waited until he went to the corral and added more. He took 1 bite at supper and looked at her. The deer did not die twice, he said. It needed salt. It needs to last until spring. The salt or the deer? She stared at him. He stared back, then his mouth twitched. Tessa threw a folded cloth at him. He caught it without looking. The ease of the moment frightened her afterward. Happiness had always seemed like something that announced its departure by first making itself comfortable. She lay awake that night waiting for punishment, bad news, or a change in him. None came. At dawn, Nantan left a pinch of extra salt beside her bowl. He began teaching her to shoot after she asked 3 times. The smaller carbine had belonged to his sister. He cleaned it before placing it in Tessa's hands. The weight surprised her. The stock smelled of oil and smoke. "Do not fight the recoil," he said. "Stand so the earth takes it with you." He positioned himself behind and to the side, close enough to catch the barrel but not touching her. Tessa planted her boots, aimed at a dead pine 30 yards away, and fired. The shot cracked across the ridge. Her shoulder jerked. Snow fell from a branch. The bullet struck nowhere she could see. Nantan looked toward the target. "You frightened it. The tree?" "Deeply." She glared at him and reloaded. By the 6th shot, she hit the trunk. By the 20th, she hit a charcoal mark he had drawn on the bark. Nantan nodded once. "That is all?" she demanded. "What more?" "I hit it." "I saw. You might say I did well. You did not close your eyes." Tessa lowered the rifle. "That is a miserable compliment. It is an important one." She understood later. Silas had gone through life with his eyes closed at the moment his choices struck other people. Reed hid behind legal language. Martha survived by refusing to look directly at what she could not stop. Nantan wanted Tessa to see where every bullet went. By January, she could load the carbine in darkness and hit a tin cup from 40 paces. He taught her to listen after a shot, to count the echoes, to smell the barrel for damp powder. He never called the weapon protection. He called it responsibility. One evening, while she cleaned it near the hearth, she asked, "Did you ever intend to make me your wife?" He stopped sharpening his knife. "I intended to keep you alive." "That was not my question." "No." Outside, sleet tapped the window. Nantan laid the whetstone down. A wife is not given by men at a river. What is she given by? Nothing. She gives herself, and the man does the same. Tessa's hands remained on the carbine. "Have you ever had a wife?" "No." "Wanted one?" His gaze settled on the fire. "Once, before the mine. After, wanting seemed like asking the world to find what I feared losing." She thought of the little space his sleeping hide had crossed, of the ribbon he wore, of the gloves shaped for her hands. "Perhaps wanting is not the same as taking," she said. "No." His voice lowered. "It is sometimes harder." They did not speak again that night. The first touch that belonged to neither injury nor instruction happened in February. Tessa was carrying a pot from the stove when her heel slipped on melted snow. Nantan caught her wrist with one hand and the pot with the other. Hot broth sloshed over the rim onto his sleeve. She set the pot down and reached for him. "Did it burn you?" "It is nothing." She rolled up the wet sleeve. The skin beneath had reddened. She pressed a cool cloth over it, and Nantan watched her face rather than the burn. When she looked up, they were closer than they had ever been. The cabin seemed suddenly full of small sounds. Water dripping from the eaves, a coal settling in the stove, the quiet scrape of his breath. Tessa kept one hand around his forearm. His pulse moved beneath her fingers. He could have leaned forward. He did not. She understood that the distance was hers to cross. Tessa touched his cheek, tracing the old scar with her thumb. Nantan closed his eyes for 1 second, the brief surrender of a man accustomed to guarding every opening. She kissed him. It was not the devouring act whispered about by married women in Oakhaven. It was hesitant and warm, his mouth still until she moved closer. Then his free hand came to rest against the table beside her, not around her waist, as if he needed to brace himself against the force of what he refused to seize. When they separated, Tessa's heart beat painfully. Nantan opened his eyes. "Was that a choice?" he asked. "Yes." "Will it remain one tomorrow?" The question made her throat ache. "Yes." He nodded, though relief softened his whole face. They ate the spilled stew from the repaired bowl. After that, affection entered their days without ceremony, his hand at the small of her back when they crossed ice, her head on his shoulder while he repaired tack, a kiss by the spring when the first thaw opened a line of water beneath the snow. They did not rush toward what the treaty had assumed could be demanded. They approached each other as they approached the mountain, attentive to weather, footing, and the possibility of harm. One night, Tessa invited him to share the bed. He stood beside it for so long she almost laughed. "You have faced armed men," she whispered. "Surely a quilt cannot defeat you. Armed men are simpler." He lay beside her, fully clothed at first, rigid beneath the blanket. Tessa took his hand and placed it over her heartbeat. "There," she said, nothing hidden. His fingers spread gently against her ribs. They came together slowly. With pauses and questions, the darkness filled not by conquest but by trust. Later, Nantan rested his forehead against hers and breathed as though he had run a great distance. Tessa thought of the treaty burning in the stove. No paper had made this. No council had authority over it. Morning found them tangled beneath the quilt while snowlight filled the room. Nantan woke first. Habit pulled his gaze toward the rifle, the door, the window. Then he looked at her. "You are still here," he said. "So are you." His smile was small and private. By March, the snow began to sink. Black stones appeared along the southern slope. Water ran under the ice with a hollow sound. Tessa planted onion bulbs in boxes near the window and spoke of a garden as if the mountain had already agreed. Nantan repaired the roof and expanded the corral. He built a second shelf beside Tessa's herbs. Their separate belongings mingled until neither could say which side of the cabin belonged to whom. The first warning came on a bright afternoon. They were following the lower trail to check for washouts when Nantan raised one hand. Tessa stopped. A bay gelding lay in the ravine below, stiff beneath a gathering of crows. A bullet wound marked its shoulder. The saddle had been stripped, but the bridle remained twisted beneath its head. Nantan climbed down and knelt beside the animal. Tessa followed more slowly. Near the horse lay an empty whiskey bottle with a chipped amber neck. A square of red cloth clung to a thorn bush. Boot prints crossed the mud, 3 men, perhaps 4. Nantan lifted the bottle and smelled it. His face changed, not fear, recognition. "Who?" Tessa asked. "Ilias Thorn." She knew the name. Thorn trapped wolves for bounty, hunted men when the territorial courts offered enough money, and drank at Pike's store until someone bled. He had once cornered Tessa behind the church during a summer dance, and told her she would be prettier if fear did not make her mouth so stiff. Amos Bell found them before Thorn touched her. "What does he want here?" Nantan looked at the boot prints leading uphill. "Oakhaven has placed a bounty on the ghost of the Gila. Why now? Because fear grows bored when it has nothing to feed." Tessa glanced toward the hidden cabin. "And me? He will call it rescue." The word chilled her more than the wind. Nantan stood and checked the carbine slung across her back. "We go home," he said. For the first time, Tessa heard him use the word without hesitation. They climbed toward the ridge while crows settled behind them. Nantan did not hurry once they reached the cabin. That frightened Tessa more than panic would have. He moved through the clearing with careful economy, checking the corral gate, studying the soft ground near the spring, and circling the cabin until he found a print beneath the east window. The heel was narrow and worn on the outside. Elias Thorn had stood there recently enough that the mud still held the sharp edge of his boot. Tessa looked through the glass from inside. From that spot, a man could see the table, the bed, and the stove. He could have watched them eat. He could have watched them sleep. She pulled the curtain closed. Nantan set a small bell on a wire along the northern trail. He strung another line through dry seed pods that would rattle if disturbed. Near the spring, he covered a shallow pit with branches, not deep enough to break a leg, but enough to drop a careless man to his knee. "You have done this before," Tessa said. "Too often." Were they always coming for you? Sometimes they came for land, sometimes horses, sometimes a story they could sell in a saloon. And now they come for a bounty, and for the right to say you were never free. Tessa checked the carbine. Then they will hear otherwise. Nantan turned from the trip line. If they come, you stay inside. No, his expression hardened. This is not a lesson with a pine tree. I know. Thorn will shoot through a door to reach what is behind it. Then why would I wait behind the door? Because I can move faster if I am not looking for you. The truth of that angered her because it was not an insult. Tessa walked to the porch and looked toward the lower trail. I spent my whole life being kept out of decisions because men said danger required it. Then they made the most dangerous decision of all without me. Nantan came to stand beside her. I will not order you into a cage, he said. I am asking you to let me use what I know. She rested the carbine against the porch post. And what do? Prepare water leanin. Keep the fire low after dark. If one reaches the cabin, you defend the threshold. Our threshold. His gaze moved to her face. Yes, they worked until sunset. Tessa filled every container with water. She ground dried yarrow and osha root, set clean bandages beside the stove, and moved the table where it could provide cover without blocking the door. She packed corn cakes, jerky, and a small bottle of whiskey Nantan kept for wounds. She loaded the carbine and placed extra cartridges in the pocket of her skirt. Nantan darkened the bright metal on his rifle with soot. He changed into a buckskin shirt the color of bark and tied his hair close to his head. Before leaving, he rubbed a line of charcoal beneath each eye. The transformation was not magical. It was worse because Tessa understood it. He was not becoming a monster. He was putting on the face other men had forced him to use. She touched the blue ribbon braided near his neck. Bring this back, she said. His hand covered hers briefly. Keep the door barred after I go. I will bar it when I choose. A quiet breath passed through him, almost amusement, almost pride. Then choose wisely. He disappeared among the trees. Night gathered slowly. The cabin smelled of banked coals and crushed herbs. Tessa sat on the floor beside the window, where she could see the narrow approach without placing herself in front of the glass. For an hour there was only wind. Then the seed pods rattled to the north. A man cursed. Another laughed too loudly and told him to watch his feet. Tessa's mouth went dry. The voices moved closer. Elias Thorne spoke as if the mountain belonged to him. Smoke is ahead. Reed said the cabin sits under the Black Ridge. We take the girl alive. The Apache only needs enough face left for identification. A younger man asked about the treaty. Thorne spat. Paper written with savages isn't law. You signed as a witness. I signed because Reed told me to. The third man snickered. Heard the Miller girl was pretty before winter got her. Tessa wrapped both hands around the carbine so they would stop shaking. The bell on the northern line gave one soft note. Silence followed. Thorne whispered something she could not hear. A rifle cracked from the western slope. The shot struck a pine above the men, showering them with bark. Horses screamed. Leather creaked as riders fought their reins. A second shot broke a saddle strap. One man fell heavily and rolled through brush. Nantan's voice came from somewhere high among the rocks. Turn back. Thorne fired toward the sound. The muzzle flash exposed him for an instant behind a fallen log. Nantan's next bullet struck the rifle from his hands. Metal spun into the dark. The younger man bolted downhill. His horse hit the shallow pit near the spring and threw him into the snowmelt. He rose on one knee, stunned, and found Tessa standing on the porch with the carbine aimed at his chest. He stared at her. Tessa? She recognized Caleb Pike, the dry goods merchant's nephew. He had shared a school bench with her for 2 winters. Once he put a frog in her lunch pail and apologized by giving her half an apple. Now mud streaked his face and a pistol hung at his belt. Take it out with 2 fingers, she said. Set it down. Tessa, we came to help you. Set it down, he obeyed. Thorne shouted from the trees. She's bewitched, boy. Get out of her line. Caleb looked toward the voice. Tessa fired into the ground beside his boot. He jumped. Do not make me choose twice, she said. Caleb unbuckled the gun belt and dropped it. Then he raised both hands. The third man ran for the lower trail. Nantan let him go. Thorne tried to reach his fallen rifle. A dark shape moved behind him. The Winchester stock struck the back of his wrist. He cried out and rolled, clutching his arm. Nantan appeared beside the log, rifle steady. He could have killed Thorne. Everyone in the clearing knew it. Thorne knew it most of all. His face twisted. Do it then. Nantan's breath smoked in the cold. No. You afraid of the bounty getting smaller if they can't see my work? I want you to carry the truth downhill. Thorn laughed through his pain. What truth? That she aimed at your man before I did. Tessa kept the carbine on Caleb. He looked sick. Nantan gestured with his rifle. Take your horses. Leave the weapons. Thorn struggled upright. You think this ends here? No. The certainty in Nantan's voice silenced him. Thorn and Caleb mounted the two uninjured horses. Caleb would not look at Tessa. Thorn did, his hatred clean and personal now. You'll beg Reed to take you back when this place turns on you, he said. Tessa lowered the barrel just enough to meet his gaze without the sights between them. The mountain has never called me property. Thorn kicked his horse and rode after Caleb. Nantan waited until the hoofbeats faded. Then he bent and collected the discarded weapons. Tessa's arms began to shake so badly she nearly dropped the carbine. He took it from her. I fired near him, she said. Yes, I might have hit him, yes. The agreement was what broke her. She covered her mouth and bent forward as nausea rose. Nantan stood close without touching her until she reached for his coat. His arms closed around her. Tessa pressed her face against his chest. Beneath the smell of smoke and cold leather, his heart beat hard and fast. You were afraid, she said. I was. She had never heard him admit fear so easily. For yourself. His hand tightened at the back of her coat. No. They stayed on the porch until her breathing steadied. Inside, Nantan placed Thorn's rifle and Caleb's pistol in the loft. He examined the cabin walls for stray rounds. One bullet had buried itself in the cedar beside the window, close enough that Tessa could cover it with her palm. She dug it out with the tip of a knife. The flattened lead sat on the table beside the smooth river stone and the repaired bowl. What will they do now? She asked. Thorn will make his shame sound like a public danger. Reed knows the treaty holds. Reed knows what keeps his badge. Tessa thought of the sheriff, reading legal words while her father abandoned her at the river. How many men can Oakhaven send? Enough to burn the cabin. She looked around the room. The shelves she had filled, the herbs hanging from the rafters, the second stool Nantan had built, the bed they now shared. Then we could leave. Nantan went still. Would you? He asked. Tessa considered the question honestly. Freedom was not proven by refusing every retreat. A person could choose to save her life and still own it. They could ride west, find another range, build again. But she saw Thorn standing in this room after they fled. Saw him kicking apart the stove, taking the rifle from the mantel, telling Oakhaven that the savage ran and the woman had been recovered from madness. She saw the story harden around them until no truth remained. I will leave if the mountain tells us to, she said. Not because Elias Thorn does. Nantan nodded. They did not sleep. Near midnight, a bird called twice from the eastern ridge. Nantan answered with a whistle that Tessa had never heard him use. A short while later, 3 riders entered the clearing without touching any of the warning lines. The first was a woman near Nantan's age, wrapped in a dark wool blanket with 2 braids hanging over her shoulders. A small boy slept against her back beneath the folds. The men riding behind her carried bows and rifles, but both kept their weapons tied to their saddles. Nantan opened the door before they reached the porch. Leia, he said. The woman dismounted and struck his chest with the flat of her hand. You wait until bounty men climb into your yard before sending word? She asked in English. I did not send word. I know. That is why I struck you. Tessa had never seen anyone touch Nantan with such familiarity. He accepted the blow like a younger brother who knew resistance would only extend the lecture. Leia looked past him. Her gaze rested on Tessa, the loaded carbine near the table, and the flattened bullet beside the bowl. So, she said, you are the woman who taught him to come indoors. Tessa glanced at Nantan. He required considerable instruction. One of the men laughed. Nantan did not, but resignation softened his face. Leia entered when Tessa invited her. The men remained near the corral to tend the horses. The sleeping boy woke as Leia loosened the blanket. He blinked at Tessa, then reached immediately for the repaired bowl. No, Leia told him. That belongs to the house. Tessa filled it with warm milk and gave it to him anyway. His name was Kimi. He was Leia's sister's son. Fever had taken both his parents the previous spring, and Leia had carried him since. She and her companions had been wintering with a small group beyond the eastern ridge. A trader brought news that Oakhaven was gathering armed men. How many? Nantan asked. More by morning. Thorn tells them you stole the cattle and the woman. He says the settlement must prove it still controls the valley. Leia's mouth tightened around the last word. Men who cannot control themselves speak often of controlling land. She spread a rough map on the table, drawn on softened hide. A narrow route led east through a pass hidden from Oakhaven. Beyond it lay their winter camp, and farther south, country where Reed's badge carried no authority. "We can move before dawn," she said. "The snow has melted from the stone ledge. Their horses will not follow in darkness. Come with us. Let the settlement shout at an empty house." The offer changed the room. This was not the desperate flight Tessa had imagined. It was a real road, guided by people who knew the country. There would be shelter, food, and a community beyond the two of them. She could leave without surrendering to Oakhaven. Nantan looked at her, not at the map. Tessa understood why he had never taken her to his relatives. "Did you keep me here because they would not accept me?" Leia answered before he could. "We argued for 3 days over who would come get you from the river." Nantan gave her a warning look. She ignored it. His uncle said the agreement was an insult, and no woman should be carried into a strange camp as payment. His cousin said leaving you in Oakhaven was worse. Nantan said too many people surrounding you with kindness could still feel like another kind of fence. Tessa looked at him. "You chose this cabin so I would not owe gratitude to a whole village. I chose it so you could hear yourself think." Leia snorted. "He also chose it because he becomes foolish when he believes pain is noble." The boy drank from the bowl and watched the adults with solemn interest. Tessa studied the map. The eastern pass represented safety. It also represented a chance to know Nantan's people beyond rumors filtered through Oakhaven. She wanted that. She wanted to hear the language he used in fever spoken around a fire without fear. She wanted her life to be larger than one cabin and one enemy. But the decision before her was not whether they would ever leave the ridge. It was whether Elias Thorne could determine the hour and reason. "If we go tonight," she said, "what story reaches the valley?" Leia shrugged. Whatever story they were already going to tell. That he rescued me. That Nantan stole their cattle and ran when honest men climbed the trail. Stories do not change the truth. They changed my life. Leia considered her more carefully. Tessa touched the map where the hidden road crossed the ridge. "I may travel this pass one day. I hope I do. But I will not take it because Thorne brings torches to my home." The little boy set down the empty bowl. Milk clung to his upper lip. Leia wiped it away with her thumb. "You know they may burn the house," she said. "Yes. You know a brave decision can still be a dead one." "Yes. And this silent man will stand in front of every bullet if you let him." Tessa looked at Nantan. "That is why I will not let him stand alone." Leia rolled up the map. "Then we do not fight beside you." Nantan's brows drew together. "If Oakhaven sees our riders," she continued, "they will call it an army and forget the woman at the door. They must see her. They must hear her choose in words. Even frightened men can carry downhill." She handed the map to Tessa. "We will wait beyond the North Canyon. If the house burns, follow the creek east. If you do not come by the second dawn, we return." Nantan began to object in Apache, Leia answered sharply. Their exchange moved too fast for Tessa to follow, but the shape of it was familiar. Family arguing because fear had made affection impatient. At last Nantan fell silent. Leia touched his uninjured wrist. Her voice softened. "You have spent years becoming what enemies needed to fear. Do not forget there are people who remember you before the mask." She turned to Tessa, "And you should know this. The name Ghost of the Gila did not begin because he hunted settlers. It began when he led children out of a canyon during a cavalry sweep. Soldiers fired at shadows for 2 nights while he carried the smallest on his back. By the time they found the trail, everyone was gone." Nantan looked away, embarrassed rather than proud. Oakhaven had taken an act of rescue and sharpened it into a horror story. Tessa felt no surprise, only a familiar anger. The visitors rested until the moon dropped behind the ridge. Before leaving, Leia took a narrow woven band from her own wrist and tied it around Tessa's sleeve. The pattern was black, white, and deep red. "This is not a claim," she said. "It tells my family that you enter by choice." Tessa touched the weaving. "Thank you. Thank me by keeping him from sleeping in snow when a roof is available. I have been trying." Nantan held the door for her. "You have said enough?" "I began saying enough when we were children." She embraced him, then mounted with Kimi bundled against her back. The 3 riders disappeared toward the north without leaving a clear trail. Tessa and Nantan stood in the clearing after they were gone. Dawn had begun to pale the eastern sky. "You would have left if I asked," Tessa said. "Yes, even though you want to defend this place. It is wood and stone. You built it. I built it to hold a life, not to become one." Tessa took his hand. "Then whatever happens here, we are not trapped." "No. For the first time since finding Thorn's bottle, she felt calm. Staying could only be a choice if leaving was possible. The hidden map inside her coat made that freedom real. The next morning he led her north. They climbed above the spring to a narrow canyon hidden behind a wall of juniper. Inside grazed more than 40 cattle, their coats shaggy from winter. Tessa recognized brands from Oakhaven ranches. What are they doing here? The blizzard broke the valley fence 6 weeks ago. I found them scattered along the lower draws. Wolves had taken 2. I brought the rest here. You never told the town. I sent word with a traitor. Reed called it a lie meant to draw men into an ambush. Tessa walked among the animals. They were thin but alive. Hay had been cut beneath an overhang. A stream ran along the canyon floor. You have been feeding them when storms allow. These are their winter stores. Yes, she understood. Oakhaven's militia could burn the cabin, but if they did, they might never find the canyon before spring. Their families would pay for the pride of men with guns. Will you threaten the cattle? She asked. I will tell the truth. What they hear will be their choice. You sound certain they will come. Nantan looked south. A dark column of smoke rose beyond the third ridge, too straight for wildfire. They are already calling men together. In Oakhaven, Elias Thorne told his story beside the stove in Pike's store. He wore his injured wrist in a sling and claimed Nantan had ambushed a lawful rescue party. He said Tessa appeared at the window half-naked in Apache paint, laughing while the ghost fired at unarmed men. By the time the account reached the church steps, there were 20 warriors in the forest, and Caleb Pike had survived a bullet through his hat. Caleb said little. When pressed, he admitted Tessa had held a rifle. He did not say she could have killed him and chose not to. Sheriff Reed listened from the back of the store with his arms folded. He had not wanted the first expedition. Thorne had forced the matter by circulating a petition and offering to ride without legal authority. Reed went because an unauthorized killing on the mountain would end the peace, and because, somewhere beneath his fear, shame had begun to grow. At the river he had told himself one life was a fair price for a town. The arithmetic had seemed hard but necessary. Each night since, he had remembered the way Tessa stood alone while the council walked away. Now the town's cattle were missing. The railroad agent wanted payment by April, and Thorne promised Nantan's bounty would cover half the debt. Men liked moral causes best when they could be entered in a ledger. Reed met Silas Miller outside the store. Tessa's father looked older. His coat hung loose, and gray spread through his beard. "You're going after her?" Silas asked. "Thorne will go whether I lead him or not. Then bring her home." Reed studied him. "Is that what she wants?" Silas's mouth tightened. "She is my daughter. That did not stop you before." The words landed. Silas looked toward the church. "Martha has not spoken to me since the first snow," he said. "She sets my plate, washes my shirts, sleeps in the other room." A man can live beside judgment without hearing a word. Reed felt no pity. "You want Tessa back because your house is cold. I want a chance to put right what fear made me do. Fear did not sign your name." Silas raised his eyes. For once there was no argument in them. "No," he said. "I did. He joined the militia anyway." Martha stood in the Miller doorway while he saddled his horse. She carried Tessa's old winter coat over one arm. "Give her this," she said. Silas reached for it. Martha did not release the coat. "If she does not come, do not call her ungrateful." His face crumpled slightly. "She is our child." "She was," Martha replied. "Until you taught her otherwise." She let go. The militia left Oakhaven at dawn. Sheriff Reed, Thorne, Silas, Amos Bell, the blacksmith, the storekeeper, and 9 others. They carried rifles, blankets, lamp oil, and 2 torches wrapped against the snow. No one called the torches part of a rescue. The climb took most of the day. Nantan watched from the ridges and counted 14 riders. He could have dropped the first 3 in the narrow pass and scattered the rest. Instead, he carved warning marks into the pines and let them see flashes of his movement above them. Fear slowed the group. Horses balked at shadows. Men fired once at a raven and twice at nothing. Tessa waited in the cabin, but she did not hide. She wore her work dress, wool leggings, and the indigo wrap Nantan had traded from his cousin during autumn. Her hair was braided tightly. The carbine rested on the table, loaded but out of her hands. She had considered standing beside Nantan with the rifle. Instead, she chose to make the first thing Oakhaven saw a woman in her own doorway. Near sunset, the riders entered the clearing. Nantan stood on the porch. He wore no war paint. The blue ribbon showed in his hair. His Winchester hung at his side, barrel lowered. Stillness gathered around him until 14 armed men seemed like an uncertain crowd before one quiet figure. Sheriff Reed stopped 50 yards away. "Tessa Miller," he called. "Come out where we can see you." The name sounded old. Tessa opened the door and stepped onto the threshold. Several men inhaled sharply. Amos Bell removed his hat. Silas leaned forward in the saddle as if struck. Tessa looked different from the girl they had left at the river. Mountain sun had browned her face. Work had strengthened her shoulders. A pale scar crossed one thumb from an axe slip. She stood without shrinking from their eyes. Reed searched her for bruises, chains, some visible proof that would make the ride righteous. He found none. "Are you injured?" he asked. "No." "Are you being held here?" Tessa put one hand on the cedar doorframe. "The bar is on my side." A murmur passed through the men. Thorne pushed his horse forward. His wrist remained bandaged, but he held a revolver in his left hand. "She has been worked on," he said. "Months alone with him. She doesn't know her own mind." Tessa looked at Caleb Pike, who rode near the rear. He lowered his gaze. "I knew my mind when I told your man to drop his pistol," she said. Thorne's face reddened. "You fired at a citizen of Oakhaven. I fired into the dirt. Nantan could have killed all three of you. You rode home alive because the man you call savage showed restraint." The word moved through the clearing like wind through dry grass. Sheriff Reed raised a hand. "We came to settle this without blood." "Then why bring oil?" Tessa asked. Every eye went to the canvas-wrapped cans tied behind the blacksmith's saddle. Reed's expression tightened. Thorne answered for him. "Because if the Apache refuses lawful custody, the den comes down." Nantan's hand did not move toward his rifle. Tessa laughed once without humor. "Lawful custody. You traded me away under that law. Now you ride here to take me back under it. Does your law ever ask what I choose?" Silas dismounted. He carried her old coat over his arm. For a moment Tessa saw him as he had been when she was small, lifting her to reach apples from a tree in Massachusetts. Then she saw the river again, his hand releasing her reins. "Tess," he said. The childhood name cut deeper than she expected. He approached slowly, stopping well beyond the porch. "Your mother sent this." He held up the coat. "She misses you. Did she send you to bring me home?" Silas looked down. "She told me not to call you ungrateful if you stayed." That sounded like Martha. Tessa stepped off the porch and crossed half the distance. Nantan remained behind her, not crowding, not claiming. Silas extended the coat. She took it. The wool smelled faintly of cedar chips and the lavender soap her mother used. One cuff had been mended with tiny gray stitches. "Thank her," Tessa said. Silas's eyes filled. "Come back and tell her yourself." "I cannot. Cannot or will not, will not." His shoulders sagged. "I was afraid," he said. "The cattle were gone." Men spoke of raids. Reed said one life could spare 200. "I told myself a father had to think of more than his own house. You thought of your house first. You offered my name before the lots were drawn." He flinched. "Who told you?" "Amos's sister wrote it in the church record. Mother packed the page inside my sewing book." Silas glanced toward Amos Bell. The man stared at the ground. Tessa had found the folded record weeks after burning the treaty. She had read it once and fed it to the same fire. "I have no defense," Silas whispered. "No. Can you forgive me?" The clearing held its breath. Tessa looked at the coat in her hands. Forgiveness in Oakhaven had always meant restoring a man's comfort. Reverend Cole demanded it from wives before their bruises faded. Silas wanted it now as proof that his regret mattered more than the wound. "I may forgive you one day," she said, "but forgiveness is not a road back into my life. It does not return what you sold." He closed his eyes. "I am your father. You were the first man who taught me that blood does not guarantee safety." Behind her, Nantan remained silent. Tessa turned toward the militia. "You all watched. Some of you were afraid. Some agreed. Some told yourselves there was no other way. Not one of you asked me. The man you call Ghost has asked me every day since." She pointed to the cabin. "He slept outside his own door until I invited him in. He taught me the trails, gave me a rifle, and never once used the treaty to demand my body or obedience. I am not staying because I have forgotten Oakhaven. I am staying because I remember it clearly." The blacksmith lowered his shotgun. Amos Bell looked up at last. "Is he your husband?" Tessa glanced back at Nantan. The word no longer belonged to the council's paper. It belonged to winter nights, shared labor, questions asked in the dark, and the blue ribbon in his hair. "Yes," she said. "By my choice." Nantan's eyes changed. Only Tessa saw it. Thorne spat into the snow. "A white woman doesn't get to choose against her own kind." Tessa faced him. "Then I am grateful you do not count me among yours." His revolver rose. Nantan moved, but Sheriff Reed was closer. The sheriff struck Thorne's arm aside as the shot fired. The bullet tore through the porch roof. Horses reared, men shouted and lifted rifles. Tessa dropped the coat and drew the carbine from behind the rain barrel where she had placed it. She levered around and aimed at Thorne. Nantan's Winchester covered the militia. For one breath, the clearing balanced on a thin edge. Thorne fought Reed's grip. "She's aiming at a lawman." "You are not a lawman," Reed said. He twisted the revolver free and threw it into the snow. "Lower your weapons," he shouted. Some men obeyed. Others looked toward Nantan, waiting. Nantan lowered his barrel first. The act shamed them into following. Reed pushed Thorne away. "You fire again. I take you back in irons." Thorne stared at him. "You'll lose your badge. Perhaps I should." The sheriff turned toward Tessa. His face looked older than it had at the river. "I signed the treaty," he said. "I told myself keeping the town alive made it lawful. It did not." "No," Tessa said. "I cannot undo it. No." Reed accepted the answer. Then he looked at Nantan. "Do you know where they are?" Nantan spoke for the first time since the riders arrived. "North Canyon. 41 alive. 2 taken by wolves, 1 died in the storm," the screeper swore softly. "You have them?" Reed asked. "I found them after your fence broke. I sent word." Reed glanced at Thorne. Thorne's mouth tightened. "Traitor was a liar. You stopped the message? I stopped us from walking into an ambush." Nantan's voice remained level. "The herd is watered. They can be moved when the lower pass clears." The blacksmith stepped forward. "You kept our cattle through winter?" "I kept cattle from dying." No one knew what to say to that. The truth rearranged the scene. They had climbed the mountain with torches to kill the man feeding their family's animals. Reed removed his hat. "We will leave," he said. "The peace stands. No man from Oakhaven crosses this ridge armed without invitation." Thorne laughed harshly. "You think one speech makes him harmless?" "No," Reed replied. "I think restraint does." He looked at Tessa. "Your choice is witnessed. I did not need witnesses." "No, but Oakhaven does." One by one the riders turned. Silas remained on foot. He stared at the coat lying between them. Tessa picked it up and draped it over her arm. "Tell Mother I am alive," she said. "Tell her I have a garden planned for spring." Silas nodded, unable to speak. "Tell her the door is not locked against her." Hope rose too quickly in his face. "Not you," Tessa added. The hope went out. He bowed his head and returned to his horse. Caleb Pike was the last of the militia to pass her. He paused. "You could have shot me." He said, "Yes." "Why didn't you?" Tessa looked toward Nantan. "I had a patient teacher." Caleb rode after the others. Thorne did not leave willingly. Reed took his horse's reins and led him down the trail. Before the trees hid them, Thorne looked back at the cabin with a promise of future hatred. Nantan watched until the final hoofbeat disappeared. Then the rifle slipped from his hand. Tessa crossed the porch as his knees gave way. She caught his shoulders, but his weight carried them both down to the boards. Blood spread beneath his coat. "The shot," she said. Thorne's bullet had not passed harmlessly through the roof. A splintered piece of lead or wood had torn into Nantan's side when he moved in front of her. He had stood through the entire confrontation without showing it. Tessa dragged open his coat. The wound lay below his ribs, dark and ragged. "Nantan, I am here. Do not speak as if that settles it." She shouted toward the trail, but the riders were already too far to hear. Perhaps that was better. She did not want Oakhaven filling the cabin while she fought to keep him alive. Tessa got one arm around his back. "You must stand," he tried. Pain folded him. "Look at me," she ordered. "You taught me the earth can carry recoil. Let me carry this." Together they crossed the threshold. She lowered him beside the hearth and cut away his shirt. The wound had no exit. The bullet was lodged shallowly beneath the skin, misshapen after striking wood. Tessa poured whiskey over her knife and held it in the flame. Nantan watched her preparations. "You have done this once," he said. "On a pig. Did it live?" "We ate it." A breath that might have been laughter escaped him, then turned into a groan. She gave him a strip of leather to bite and knelt beside his hip. The cabin narrowed to blood, firelight, and the work of her hands. She cut, searched, and found lead with the knife tip. Nantan's body went rigid, but he did not pull away. When the bullet came free, it struck the bowl on the floor with a small metallic sound. Tessa packed the wound with yarrow and bound it tightly. Only after the bleeding slowed did she realize tears were running down her face. Nantan lifted one hand toward her, but lacked the strength to reach. She took it and pressed his palm to her cheek. "You were supposed to bring the ribbon back," she whispered. His eyes opened. The blue strip remained braided near his neck, stained but intact. "I did. Fever came before midnight. For 2 days Tessa fed the fire, changed bandages, and forced broth between his lips. Nantan drifted in and out of dreams. Sometimes he spoke in Apache. Sometimes he begged an unseen man to remove chains. Once he called for Atsa. Tessa answered each time, though she did not know the words he needed. On the second night, snow began again. Wind rubbed branches against the roof. Tessa sat beside the bed with her head on her arms. Nantan woke and found her there. "You should sleep," he said. "So should you." "I have. You have argued with 3 ghosts and threatened the stove. The stove was winning." Relief hit her so sharply, she laughed and cried at once. His fever broke before dawn. When he was strong enough to sit, Tessa brought the repaired bowl filled with stew. She placed it between them on the bed. Nantan ate 2 spoonfuls and pushed it toward her. They shared the meal from the same bowl. No porch, no closed door, no measured distance. Afterward, he leaned his head against her shoulder. "I could not hear you at the river," he said. "What?" "When you said father. I saw your mouth move, but the crowd was loud." Tessa remembered Silas walking away. "I thought if I looked at you, I would kill him," Nantan continued. "Then the peace would end before it began. You did not owe me vengeance." "No." His fingers tightened around hers. "I owed you a road away. You gave me one." She looked around the cabin. "It ended here." Nantan shook his head. "No, it began here." By the time he could walk to the porch, the militia's tracks had softened under new snow. Tessa supported him with one arm around his waist. They stood at the threshold and looked over the clearing. The bullet hole in the porch roof allowed a thin blade of sunlight through. "I will repair it," Nantan said. "In spring, before the next snow. You can barely lift a cup." "I lifted the cup." "You complained until I helped." "I stated the cup was poorly placed." Tessa smiled. "In spring," he conceded with a nod. That afternoon they burned the oil-soaked torch left by the militia. The flames smelled bitter. Tessa watched until the cloth and handle collapsed into the stove. Then she swept the ashes out with the remains of the treaty. News traveled strangely in frontier country. By April, traders passing below the ridge knew that Tessa Miller had chosen to remain with Nantan Ironwood. Some said she had become an Apache medicine woman. Others said she commanded the ghost with witchcraft. The least popular version, because it was the simplest, was that a man had treated a woman with respect and she loved him for it. Sheriff Reed kept his word. He posted a notice in Oakhaven declaring the northern ridge protected under the peace agreement and forbidding armed parties without council approval. The council protested until the cattle returned from the hidden canyon. 41 animals walking down the thawing trail under Nantan's guidance. He did not enter the town. He stopped at the old river landing and turned the herd over to Amos Bell. Reed was there. So was Silas. Tessa remained on the ridge. The decision was hers. She was not ready to place her feet in Oakhaven's dust. Silas gave Nantan a small wooden box. "Martha asked me to send it. Nantan opened it after returning home. Inside lay packets of seed, beans, squash, corn, and a folded scrap of cloth carrying 6 lines in Martha's cramped hand. "Tessa, I was silent when silence helped the wrong man. I will carry that shame without asking you to make it lighter. Plant these where the morning sun reaches. The beans need poles. I am glad you are alive." Mother Tessa read the note twice. Then she sat at the table and wept. Nantan did not tell her to forgive. He did not speak against Martha or offer comfort too quickly. He placed the smooth river stone in one of her hands and held the other. In May they planted the seeds. The garden occupied a patch of dark earth below the spring. Nantan built a fence high enough to discourage deer. Tessa made rows with a hoe and pressed each seed into the soil. She planted the beans where morning light touched first. When green shoots appeared, she wrote a reply. She told Martha about the cabin, the spring, the snow, and the bowl that had survived another winter. She did not soften Silas's betrayal. She did not promise a return. At the end she wrote, "The door is not locked against you if you come alone." Martha arrived in late summer with Amos Bell driving the wagon. Tessa saw the dust from the ridge and knew before the figures became clear. Her mother climbed down slowly. She looked smaller, hair more gray than brown, hands clutching a basket against her waist. Nantan stood near the corral. He did not come forward until Tessa reached for him. Martha stopped at the edge of the porch. For a moment, mother and daughter simply looked at one another. Then Martha set down the basket. "I should have stood beside you," she said. Tessa's throat closed. Martha did not say she had been powerless. She did not ask Tessa to understand marriage, fear, or the limits of women in Oakhaven. She gave no explanation that placed the burden of mercy on the person she had failed. I should have stood beside you, she repeated. Tessa stepped off the porch and embraced her. It was not an erasure. It was a beginning. Martha stayed 3 days. She slept in the cabin while Tessa and Nantan used a shelter near the corral. She helped harvest beans, showed Tessa how to save squash seeds, and spoke to Nantan with formal care. On the second evening, she found him washing dishes. Martha watched him rinse the repaired bowl. Silas never washed one in 30 years, she said. Nantan examined the bowl. Perhaps he feared water. Martha laughed unexpectedly, a bright sound Tessa had not heard since Massachusetts. When she left, Nantan packed the wagon with venison, dried herbs, and a new handle for Martha's garden hoe. Silas never came. He sent letters twice. Tessa read the first and burned the second unopened. Years later, she would answer one, not because his regret entitled him to her voice, but because she no longer feared what replying might take from her. Alyce Thorne disappeared from Oakhaven before the next winter. Some said he went south after another bounty. Others said Reed found proof that Thorne had hidden the trader's message about the cattle and threatened him with charges. Tessa did not ask. The mountain taught her that not every shadow deserved pursuit. Sheriff Reed resigned the following spring. He returned the badge to the territorial office and opened a freight route east of Oakhaven. Before leaving, he sent Nantan a new box of rifle cartridges and Tessa a blank ledger. On the first page he had written, "For accounts no one else has the right to keep." Tessa tore out the inscription, folded it, and stored it with Martha's note. She used the ledger to record harvests, weather births among the horses, and the dates traders passed through. The entries slowly changed. June 14, first squash blossom. August 2, roof repaired at last. October 9, Nantan pretended not to like apple preserves, jar empty. December 21, snow to the lower window, plenty of wood. April 3, I told him. The last entry referred to the child. Tessa had suspected for weeks. She tired before noon, and the smell of coffee turned her stomach. She waited until certainty grew strong enough to survive being spoken. Nantan was repairing the porch step when she sat beside him. "There will be 3 of us by winter," she said. The hammer stopped. He looked at her, then toward the cabin, then back as if counting failed to produce the same answer twice. "Tessa." "Yes." Fear crossed his face so openly that she reached for him. "What is it?" "I know how to protect a trail." "A house, you, and a child? I do not know what a father should be, neither did mine." She took the hammer from his hand. That did not stop him from deciding. "You can begin by asking." Nantan placed both palms carefully against her abdomen, though there was nothing yet to feel. "May I?" he asked. Tessa laughed through tears. "You already are." Their daughter was born during the first heavy rain of autumn. Martha came to help, so did an Apache healer named Leah, Nantan's cousin, who arrived with 2 women and enough dried herbs to fill the rafters. The cabin held voices in 2 languages, boiling water, wet wool, and Nantan's silent terror as he waited on the porch, because Tessa had thrown a spoon at him when he tried to remain inside. After 12 hours, the child announced herself with a furious cry. Nantan entered only when Tessa called. He approached the bed as he had approached the threshold years before, slowly prepared to stop at the first sign he was not welcome. Tessa placed the baby in his arms. His hands, capable of levering a rifle or breaking frozen ground, shook beneath the small wrapped body. They named her Nantan Ironwood. 2 years later, a son followed, born on a clear winter morning. They called him Samuel Nantan, using the name of Tessa's grandfather and his father's. The children grew knowing the porch as a place for shelling beans, drying boots, and watching storms. They did not know it had once divided a frightened woman from the man guarding her. To them, the door was nearly always open. Years passed in work rather than legend. The cabin gained a second room, then a loft. The garden spread down the slope. Nantan planted apple trees from cuttings Martha carried west. Tessa traded preserves, medicinal salves, and stitched gloves to travelers. Nantan guided freight wagons through the high passes and refused work from men who treated animals badly. People still called him the ghost of the Gila in distant settlements. Those who knew him on the ridge called him Nantan. Tessa became the person neighbors sought when a child had fever or a horse tore itself on wire. She never called herself a healer, but her shelves filled with labeled jars and her ledger with notes on roots, wounds, and weather. Oakhaven changed slowly. Silas died 6 years after the confrontation. Martha sent word through Amos. Tessa went to the funeral. She rode into town beside Nantan, their daughter in front of him and their son asleep against Tessa's back. People watched from porches. Some looked ashamed, some curious. a few afraid. Tessa entered the church without lowering her eyes. Silas looked small in the pine coffin. Regret had not transformed him into a better father, but neither had it left him entirely unchanged. In his final years, he had spoken publicly against the council's decision and transferred his land to Martha rather than a male cousin. It was not enough. It was something. Tessa placed no flower on the coffin. She stood beside her mother. After the burial, Reverend Cole approached Nantan and offered his hand with the stiff bravery of a man performing goodness before witnesses. Nantan looked at the hand, then at Tessa. She shrugged. He shook it once. The town exhaled. On the way home, Tessa stopped at the river landing. The cottonwood had grown thicker. The mud smelled the same. She found the place where she had stood in her pale dress and waited for a monster. Atsa ran along the bank collecting stones. Samuel woke and demanded food. Nantan stood beside Tessa without speaking. "I thought my life ended here," she said. He looked toward the northern trail. It did. She raised an eyebrow. "The life they chose for you," he added. Tessa picked up a smooth gray stone and gave it to her daughter. They rode home before dark. 10 years after Oakhaven traded her, Tessa woke to the smell of coffee and cedar smoke. Rain had passed during the night. Water dripped from the eaves into a barrel. Atsa and Samuel argued in the loft about whose turn it was to gather eggs. Their boots thumped overhead. The repaired bowl sat on the table. Its old resin seemed dark against the clay. Another crack had appeared near the rim and been mended with a narrow metal staple. It was no longer pretty. It remained useful. Above the hearth hung the Ironwood rifle. Nantan kept it clean, but years had passed since he fired it at a man. The blue ribbon, faded almost gray, was tied around the stock. Tessa wrapped Martha's old coat over her nightdress and opened the door. Cold mountain air entered with the smell of wet pine and wild sage. Nantan stood by the woodpile, splitting kindling. Silver threaded his hair at the temples. The scar on his side pulled when weather changed, though he denied it. He set down the axe when he saw her. "You are letting the heat out," he said. "You spent a winter sleeping on this porch. You can survive one open door. That was before you improved the coffee." Atsa squeezed past Tessa with an egg basket. Samuel followed, wearing one boot and carrying the other. Nantan caught him before he reached the mud. "Where is your moccasin? The dog took it." They did not own a dog. Nantan looked at Tessa. She laughed and went inside to find the missing shoe. The cabin filled with ordinary noise, the scrape of chairs, eggs cracking into a skillet, children complaining about chores, the kettle lid rattling. Sun broke through the clouds and reached across the floorboards to the place beside the door where Nantan once slept. No one occupied it now. The threshold had not disappeared. Tessa understood that boundaries never did. They were remade through attention, through the asking and answering that kept love from turning into ownership. The door could close against danger and open for those who arrived with respect. Its strength belonged to the person who chose. Nantan came in carrying an armful of wood. He paused automatically to knock mud from his boots. Tessa took the top pieces from him. Their fingers brushed. Even after 10 years, he waited the smallest moment before tightening his hand around hers. She closed the door with her heel, not because the world had become safe, but because this room was warm and breakfast was burning. Home had never been the cabin alone. It was the question asked before a touch, the bowl placed across a distance, the rifle lowered first. The road a frightened woman was allowed to choose, and the man who walked it beside her without once claiming to own the destination. Outside, the Gila peaks rose into the morning, hard and bright after rain. Inside, Tessa turned the eggs. Nantan poured coffee, and their children argued over the last piece of bread. The door remained unlocked.